We've been debating since the beginning of the modern UFO era what the impact of realization that we're being visited might have on society. Speculation and studies have been done about whether our social institutions would collapse, would disintegrate in the face of what presumably would be a much more advanced race of people. And a lot of folks think that we're not ready to understand that kind of thing. Well, I think the viewers, the listeners of this program are certainly ready for it, because this is something you've been interested in. You've all been studying it and hearing about it and debating it for a lot of years. It was only a little bit later that I learned about the flying saucer story, about the possibility that ET technology was being stored and tested out at Area 51, actually more specifically a place called S4. And the reason I heard about it is the guy who's going to be coming on in a couple of minutes, John Lear. John has a distinguished career as a pilot. He's flown missions all over the world for the CIA. His father is the inventor of not only the Lear jet, but the 8-track tape system, which was mighty fine technology back in its day. Just a moment from now, we're going to be talking with John Lear, and you should buckle up your seats because you don't want to miss it. I'm back in a moment with Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp. Let's get right to it. John Lear is a retired airline captain, a former CIA pilot, as well as the son of the famous inventor of the Lear jet. He's flown over 150 test aircraft. He's won every award granted by the FAA. He holds 18 world speed records and has worked for 28 different aircraft corporations. But back during the 1980s, his life sort of took a different kind of a twist when he started looking into the UFO mystery and issued a manifesto that today remains controversial. John, great to hear you. Great to talk to you.
Good evening, George, and good evening to all my friends at AboveTopSecret.com, the three amigos, Mark, Bill, and Simon. And just a reminder that all the stuff I'm talking about with George can be found on AboveTopSecret.com.
Well, glad you got that plug out of the way, John. Let's go back to the beginning, at least for me. 1987 is 20 years ago. The first time I met and talked to you. You came into the TV station, and you already had some credibility with my news managers because of some other stories you'd worked on with them that became international stories. You tried to talk my mentor and friend, the late Ned Day, into taking a look at a stack of UFO documents. Ned wanted nothing to do with them, but I was eavesdropping, and I said, hey, let me take a look at that stuff. And I was just flabbergasted by what I read. I think it included the MJ-12 documents as well as some documents that have been squeezed out of the government through the FOIA process that you provided me. And so I had you on a little show I had back then called On the Record, one of those shows that airs at 4 o'clock in the morning and nobody watches, and the mayor would come on or a city councilman and talk about things that nobody cared about. And you come on and start talking about flying saucers, and my phone was ringing off the hook. I had you on again a second time, and the response was even bigger. And I realized that whatever you were saying touched the pulse of the public in a way that I had no appreciation for previously. So that's how I got started in looking into UFOs. I'm not sure if I should thank you or blame you for that.
That's exactly the way it happened. And I remember I was very good friends with Ned. He helped me expose a couple of frauds that were going on in Las Vegas, one with the police department. And he was really a good guy, really informed. And if you remember, I was the one that tipped him off to the stealth fighter. I think it was in the early 80s before anybody knew about it. And he was writing for the Valley Times, Bob Brown. And when he wrote the story, he misunderstood what I said and said it was a stealth fire, F-I-R-E, instead of stealth fighter. Anyway, we both almost went to jail over that one. But I do remember that day clearly when I was in there trying to tell Ned about what was going on at Area 51. And I remember what he said to me. He said, John, it's not possible. I would have known about it. And that's when you came up and said, I'd like to take a look at your stuff.
Well, I sure am glad for that, because back in those days you were very gracious to help a rookie investigator look into this stuff, providing me time and expertise and a lot of access to your files, voluminous files, and really gave me a good underpinning and understand, at least get started on this mystery. You know, I was kind of cocky about the whole thing back then, John, thinking, well, look, what this mystery needs is a good investigative reporter. Give me 6 months, I'll have this wrapped up. And of course, that was 20 years ago. We're certainly not any closer to it. You had had an interest in Area 51 long before the rest of the world had heard about the place. I think something in the late 70s with Bob Stoddall, another Las Vegas newsman, right?
Yeah, back in 1963, when I was working as a flight instructor in Hawthorne, I found out about the SR-71, and the guy who told me about it talked about a secret place up in Nevada, and it took me like 4 or 5 years to find out exactly where it was. First of all, I thought it was up at Tonopah, and then I came up here to work for a little while in Las Vegas, and one of the pilots that used to fly up there like in 1967, 1968 says, no, the place is called Groom Lake. So I looked at that on a map, and by gosh, that's where it turned out to be. So then I moved up to Las Vegas flying for an airline, and Bob Stoddall ran a story for Channel 8, and the story was security leak at Groom Lake. So I called him up and I said, Bob, I've never heard anybody mention Groom Lake on television. Are you supposed to do that? And he said, well, it's there, and we do have a story on it. So I said, well, let's have lunch. So I went down to have lunch with Bob, and we met at the Flame. Remember the Flame, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So, and then we started talking, and he says, well, it doesn't make any difference anyway because it's going to be exposed next in a few weeks. AP and UPI are going in on foot. And I thought, oh, shoot, that's great, but I wanted to be first. So I grabbed a couple of my airline buddies, and we drove out there about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I think it was like a weekday morning, and that was before the guard gate was there. And we drove over to the other side, and I took a bunch of pictures. And we got there like about 7 o'clock in the morning. The lake bed was wet. I think it was in the winter or it just rained, and we got a bunch of pictures. And that one picture, they happened to have one of the MiGs out in front of the hangars, and that particular picture is on the Special Projects website.
It's that blows your mind, doesn't it, that you were able to get that close to the base and take photos and nobody hassled you? You didn't get arrested? I mean, that would be impossible now.
Yeah, it would be impossible now. About 10 minutes later, we saw a cloud of dust as a guy was driving around. So it was kind of funny because I had my old Mark IV 73 Lincoln, black, and a couple airline guys. We were just standing there, and I had the camera on a tripod. So what happened is this guard was letting a pickup truck out. So all there was a little chain link or just a chain across the road, and he let the chain down, let the guy go through, and he's putting the chain back up. He turns around, and there we are. We're not like 10 feet away, and he didn't notice us. And he said, what are you guys doing here? And we said, we're not supposed to be here. And he says, hell no, you're not supposed to be here. And so he says, you wait right there. So he goes back to the truck, and he gets a radio, and he calls somebody. And he comes back and starts talking to us. He says, you wait right here. They're coming out to check on you. And while we were waiting for the other guys to come out, we told him, I told him, look, I grew up in Van Nuys, California. I used to see the Lockheed 3 Constellations take off every Monday morning, come back every Friday afternoon. Many of my friends flew the SR-71. I hang out at the pilot's table at the Van Nuys Airport. I forget what they called that restaurant. Oh, the Trails. And we told them about the history. I told, first guy to fly it was who that was. I'm trying to think of his name. Then went through the whole thing. I said I had a good friend named Daryl Greenemeyer. He was the 5th guy to fly it. So by the time the other guy gets over there, this other guy is really hot, and he shows up and he starts screaming at us. What the heck are you doing here? And the guard who was there talking to us, he turns around and says, relax, they know everything. So the upshot was the guy that came the next day, he says, okay, well, I got to see some driver's licenses and Social Security numbers, and there was, they kept us there for maybe half an hour or so, and he said, okay, here's the deal. We want you guys to leave, drive in Las Vegas. In a week, you're going to get a call, and you're going to get a briefing, and then you're going to get a debriefing. And so we left, drove back, and never heard another word.
Huh. Tell me this, John. Did you have a suspicion back then, or perhaps the best way to ask it would be, when did your suspicion about ET-type technology being out there, when did that develop? It was, I know a lot of people think it started with Bob Lazar, but it was well before that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was before that. See, the three guys that were interested in groom light and really did the research on the SR-71 and the U-2 were me, John Andrews, and Jim Goodall. And John Andrews was the U-2 guy, the interested guy, and Jim Goodall was the SR-71 guy. And I was just interested in secret airplanes, not about UFOs. I didn't know anything about those. As a matter of fact, there's a famous letter floating around on the internet that John Andrews, who was then vice president of testers, wrote to me telling me about UFOs and that I should check into it. And the famous letter was the one I wrote back saying there's nothing to it. I already checked it out.
So I'm sure people have flashed that in your face now and then.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you know the approximate year when you're hearing the ET stuff?
Yeah, I think 84 or 85, I was over at a friend's house in Las Vegas, and I picked up this book called Missing Time by Bud Hopkins. And I read that thing, and I'll tell you, the hairs on the back of my neck rose up because I knew instantly that that was true. Now, I don't know how I knew it was true, but I said, this is true. And
that's when you started...
Then I ran into the guy, the Air Force guy that I knew over in Laos. He was one of the Ravens. The sheep dip guys that they took out of the Air Force, gave civilian ID, and they flew in Laos for us. Greg Wilson was his name. He lives down in New Orleans, and I met him at one of the Southeast Asia pilot reunions here in Vegas, and I think it was 1984. And we started talking, and he told me he was at Bentwaters. Well, stationed at Bentwaters flying A-10s. Well, I knew that Bentwaters figured into this story because in 1980 there was a landing there of three saucers, and it was a big deal. It was called the Bentwaters incident, and there was a book about it. So I said, well, Bentwaters, I said, did you ever hear about the Bentwaters incident? He said, yeah, I was there that night. He said, I didn't get to go out and see the saucers, but I know the guys who did. And I said, wait a minute, you mean this stuff is true? And he says, as far as I know it is. And then he told me the story. And those two things, Bud Hopkins' book and what Greg told me, were the ones that really set me off on saying, I got to find out what's going on.
Now, you knew a lot of guys in aviation circles. You knew a lot of guys in intelligence circles, military circles. So you basically went on a one-man information campaign to find out what everybody knew, right?
Right. And basically, most of those guys knew nothing. And, it was so secret. And then I took that little trip in 1987 where I went drove all through Colorado, New Mexico. That's when I joined up with Linda Howe. And we went down to Roswell, and we ran into all those mutilated cows. I mean, it was the most bizarre trip I ever made. And that's when we met Clifford Stone, and I met some of the UFO guys in Crestone, Colorado, to exchange information with them. And then on my way back, when I was coming back from Kingman, that's when the drive from Kingman to the dam was as black could be. Do you remember making that drive when it was black?
Sure.
Now, these days, I mean, there's lights the whole way, but those days, like 1987 is when I drove back, it was black, and something followed me, and it scared the living daylights out of me. And it was, it was just a light, or actually it was two lights, and it never threatened me, but it scared me to death. And I got home, and that's when I wrote that, the world is round, or whatever the thing it was. And, I assembled all the information that I had and started out, and that's what started the whole thing.
I was going through my John Lear files in preparation for this program and found some real treasures. And one of the things I have is the statement you released December 29th, 1987. Attached on the front of it is a handwritten note from you, some background information. Dear George, attached is some background information you may need for the next year. Happy holidays, which is quite a collector's item because this really put you into the maelstrom, into the eye of the storm of UFOs and UFO theories, and you caught a lot of flack for it.
Yeah, did I ever? And when I started talking about this, I had no idea that the military and the government not only knew all about it, but they were, they were in on the whole thing. It just didn't occur to me.
Let me ask you this. Something else I found in that file of John Lear stuff is an article from August of 1957 from I think it was called the NICAP Bulletin. It's about your father. And I was wondering if, I know you and I have talked about it privately about this before, whether you ever got any information on this subject from your father, William P. Lear Sr., but in this article, it notes, in a surprising reversal, it says, William P. Lear, noted aviation and electronics inventor, recently stated that the flying saucers do not carry creatures from other planets, but probably are intelligence-gathering devices launched from other worlds. In February 1955, Lear publicly revealed his belief that UFOs came from outer space and are piloted by beings of superior intelligence. Did you ever sit down with your dad and have a conversation about this?
No. See, he got his hand slapped by MJ-12. He was close to most of them, particularly Hoyt Vandenberg was always at the house. He was one of the original members of MJ-12. As a matter of fact, my mom in later years, and I'm talking like 20 years ago, way after my father died, said that Hoyt Vandenberg had a crush on her. Jimmy Doolittle, who was as close to MJ-12 as you could get without having an MJ-12 number, he was always around the house. My dad was friends with Nathan Twining. My dad was on the board of the Lovelace Clinic in New Mexico. They're the ones that did the autopsies on the aliens. He was really involved, but during the time he was alive, he never discussed it with me, and I think he made some comments, but it's only in the recent, 3 or 4 years that I found out how really involved he was. He was one of the primary contractors on the anti-grav stuff that was developed between 1955 and 1958, and it was fully developed after 1958. But that statement in 57 was the response to the hand slap he got for his statement in Bogota. I'm just assuming that when he made that statement, it was totally unauthorized, and he got contact. He said, "Look, Bill, when we told you about these flying saucers, it didn't mean you were supposed to go out and tell all your friends about them."
You don't suppose he was a member of MJ-12,
no.
Do you?
No, but he was in on doing the anti-grav stuff. He was right. He was right there with, and he knew what was going on.
I remember seeing news articles, old newspaper articles, including this one I'm holding here, that mentions about his anti-gravity research, and he said, there's a quote from him, "Once we can explain gravity, we can do something about it." And then poof, those articles, it disappears. There's no more discussion of it in the public press. Do you think that was a result of him speaking about flying saucers? Or that they perhaps, that they were able to study those saucers to get our clues about how gravity works?
They studied it and perfected it between 1950. They studied it and then perfected it. Had it perfected between 1958 and 1960, and that's why you don't see any articles of any kind in Aviation Week, Space Technology, Jane's Defense Weekly. Nothing. No mention ever of any kind of research on anti-gravity, and the reason is they already have it.
I know you've had some ups and downs in your life because of your interest in UFOs, because of the things you've said publicly about them. I thought for a while that you'd given up on the topic because it was just too hard on you and your family, but now I see you sort of bounced back. You're involved in online discussions on an ongoing basis. What happened? What's the deal with your personal life and your interest in the topic?
Well, there were several times that I just kind of either took a break or said, I don't want to do this anymore, because it's so overwhelming when you realize what really is going on. It's so overwhelming that, it's tough to take. So
it's depressing too, isn't it?
Pardon?
It's depressing.
It's not depressing. Well, it's all I could say is it's overwhelming. So I took, a few months off, I think in 88 or 89, I can't remember. And then the airline that I worked for in July of 1989 called me in one day, and they said, "You don't actually believe this stuff, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do." And they said, "Well, we can't have a captain flying passengers that believes in UFOs. So, you need to find employment elsewhere. So they gave me 3 months pay, and I went and started flying DC-8, flying cargo out of Detroit, which was a lot of fun. Life has a way of working it out. I met a lot of good friends, and I kind of let the UFO thing drop for a few years. Then I took it up a little bit, but then I really didn't get back until like 2003 or 2004 when Art Bell called me up and he said, hey, why don't we do another show? And so about that time, they were talking about disclosure, and I think that's probably it's not that it's a ridiculous notion. It's just that it's never going to happen. So I had a few words to say about that, and I wrote the famous Lear disclosure briefing, and just stayed in and out of it, and I'm back in it, and I am on this forum called AboveTopSecret.com, and we discuss all of this. And what's fun about being on AboveTopSecret.com is there's so many guys with so many different ideas, and you better be able to support yours because they will crucify you because they're so knowledgeable. I mean, there's guys that get on there and they really know what they're talking about. So if you can't back up what you're talking about, you're toast.
You mentioned that you don't believe disclosure is ever going to happen. It seems like every other year or so somebody comes out with a statement, oh yeah, it's just around the corner. The good guys on MJ-12 want to spill the beans, but they're fighting with the bad guys in MJ-12, and any day now it's going to come spilling out, and of course it never does.
No,
why do you suppose that it needs to be kept a secret? And maybe that goes to the center of your thesis that you released back there in 1987.
Yeah, it goes to the core that it's really none of our business. And people say, well, what do you mean? I got a right to know if there's aliens on Earth. Well, you really don't, because it's not about that. You need to just continue on your life, be a good guy, try and get rid of the bad things in your life, which are envy, hate, and greed, and just try and improve yourself. You don't need to know about what's going on in the background. Of course, some of us want to know, and and if you want to know, I'll tell you. But it's not like there should be a mass briefing on CNN where they come on, the president comes on with his chief of staff and his joint chiefs of staff and says, aliens are here, and here's where they're from. That's never going to happen. It doesn't need to happen. Disclosure happens on a one-on-one basis. And that means that when you're ready to know, you will be told. And you won't be told by the government. You'll be told by someone else.
I know that a lot of people in our listening audience will find this frustrating, but I'll have to make an admission here myself, is that the longer I stay in the field and keep tabs on what's going on and do my own research, the less inclined I am to advocate for a complete disclosure. I agree with you completely that it's not going to happen. Perhaps for other reasons, perhaps because a lot of people would go to jail if they had to admit what they've been doing all this time. But also, I know that people think that they're ready. I know that they may be, in fact, ready for an idea that they're extraterrestrials. I'm not convinced that they're necessarily ready for what could be a very disturbing truth about the reality of life in our universe and on our planet.
You've nailed it exactly. As a matter of fact, I'm going to play that back and type it over because you just said exactly what I feel.
Why don't you give us a brief synopsis of what you came out with in the John Lear document? Because you talk about startling. There were a lot of startling things in there that really shook ufology down to its feet.
Well, it's kind of hard to remember. I haven't read that thing in a long time, but basically I talked about what I found out in the year and a half before that, and it was basically that, yes, there was a cover-up, yes, extraterrestrials are here, that a group named MJ-12 is dealing with them, that we have a lot of technology that we're trying to find out about, that there have been several agreements made. The agreements were... Now, this is what I wrote in back then. It doesn't mean I necessarily believe it now, but what I wrote was the agreements were that in return for our permission, to abduct a certain amount of humans, that the aliens would give a certain technology. There was also a little bit of the reports of the infamous Grudge 13 report, some of the gruesome UFO incidents that they had, and basically I ended up it wasn't a manifesto, but it was basically what I thought. And I said, if you ever see a flying saucer with beautiful green and yellow and blue lights, run like hell. Because I didn't have anything else to say. Here's the hilarious thing. Whitley Strieber, who used to call me practically every night, telling me about his experiences, when he read that, he called me up and he said, I read your thing. And I said, yeah. And he says, where you say run like hell? And I said, yeah. He says, where? I mean, that was just hilarious.
One of the things that you wrote in that paper was that you said that on April 30th, 1964, the first communication between aliens and the U.S. government took place at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. 3 saucers landed at a prearranged area, and a meeting was held between the aliens and intelligence officers of the U.S. government. How do you know?
That was Bob Emenegger told me that, and he's the one that was approached in the 70s. He was part of Sandler Films, which was a CIA cutout. Did their work, and they said, "Look, we're ready to release the story on UFOs. We're going to give you," and I think it was 10,000 feet of film of UFOs and that meeting and everything. And they said, "We want you to tell the story," and that was. The video that came out, UFOs Past, Present, and Future. But what happened is they made the movie and got everything ready, and at the last minute, they did have that footage, and at the last minute, the Pentagon said, no, there's been a change in plans, we don't want to do it. And so the video that you see on that's today is released, and there's several different names for it. That's why there's no conclusion in the end and no footage. I mean, the story just ends. But that was supposed to be the release. And I've spent many hours with Robert Emenegger. He's retired now. I think he lives in the South somewhere. And he told me all about the briefing they got and about that Holloman meeting. Now, that wasn't really the first one. The first one was in 1954 at Edwards Air Force Base, which was then called Muroc Air Force Base, and that's when Eisenhower had the famous meeting with the aliens there that he supposedly went to the dentist, and that's where we've had so much of the documented material on that particular meeting. So there were several meetings.
We're going to take a short break, John. When we come back, I want to ask you about the suggestion that there was some sort of a treaty to allow aliens to abduct humans. Stick around, folks. I'm George Knapp, guest host here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp, your guest host. My guest this evening, John Lear. John, in the paper that you wrote back in December of 1987, one of the central points you made was that you believed, at least back then, that there had been some kind of a deal worked out between our military and these alien visitors that would allow them to abduct humans. Here's my question about that prospect, and I don't know if you still believe that to be the case or not. But I always wondered, well, if that were true, why did the aliens have to make a deal? Couldn't they just do it on their own? Aren't they just still doing it on their own? Why would they need our permission if they're so technologically superior to us?
You're absolutely correct. There's no reason why would they have to make a deal with us. If they did, and I don't know that they did, it was a scam on their part. You know, maybe we had found out about the abductions, and they, in order to placate the military, they said, "Well, look, here's the deal. We just want to abduct a few. We'll give you the names and everything, and in return, we'll give you all this cool technology."
And do you believe that they lived up to that part of the bargain?
That the aliens?
Yeah, that they did give us the technology that perhaps was out at 51?
We got lots of cool technology. It's the other part they didn't live up to. I mean, everybody gets abducted. I thought, in those days it was 1 in 10, but it's certainly more than that.
One of the other parts that you mentioned, you get into the stuff about Groom Lake in that paper back when. It was that was my initial introduction to the possibility that alien technology had been had been tested and stored out there. This is prior to your involvement with Bob Lazar, right?
Right.
You wrote that you felt that the base had been closed down for a period between 72 and 74, and a huge underground facility was constructed out there, which is where this bargain for technology was set into place. Do you believe that to be the case still?
Yeah, there is certainly a huge underground facility there. Now, whether there's any current saucer technology there or not, I'm not sure. There is certainly aliens there in that underground area there.
That's a tough one to swallow, don't you think, for people in the audience? I mean, even people that are interested in the subject, that there could be aliens out there working at a base alongside our personnel?
Yeah, it sure is tough. And, if they'd have been in my shoes for the last 20 years, talked to the people I talked to, talked to the people, that have walked down the corridors and told the stories of, passing aliens, they believe as I do. But I don't blame them for not believing it, because it's a tough story. I mean, you just cannot hardly, grasp the fact that our military is working with aliens, and they probably, they work with at least 5 to 7 different species up there. It's not just one. There's all kinds of them up there. But that's how they keep the secret, is people just don't believe it.
You and I know a lot of people who've worked out there over the years in legitimate classified programs, SR-71, U-2, stealth fighter and stealth bomber and things like that, and people like that who have legitimate credentials who are up there, and they say, that's a bunch of baloney. I never saw any flying saucers. What do you say to those folks? Is compartmentalization and up there so severe, so strict, that even people who work there wouldn't necessarily know about this stuff?
Absolutely. I would doubt that 99% of the people that work at Groom Lake don't know what's going on there. First of all, a lot of it's underground. Second of all, it's very compartmentalized. Yes, I know people who were heavily involved in projects up there and say, no, there's nothing like that. And I also know people who say, yeah, I saw those saucers around there all the time.
You had this interest in the area, in flying saucers, and the possibility that saucers were up there. You put out this paper at the end of December of 1987, and then, lo and behold, poof, along comes a guy who seems to confirm your worst fears or your wildest suspicions, that guy being Bob Lazar. And a lot of folks think, well, that's just too darn convenient.
It was extremely weird. What happened, as you remember, in the spring of 1988, I was on my soapbox because at that time I didn't believe the military knew about this, and I wanted to tell. Well, I guess I did. I wanted to tell the public about it. So I gave that lecture at the Spring Valley Library, I think 2 weeks in a row there, and I got a call in like June or July from Gene Huff, and Gene says, "Hey, listen, I'm interested in your stuff, and I'd like to get a copy of your tapes and stuff like that." Well, but that was one of the times I had withdrawn, and I was getting so many calls, and it was just so overwhelming. I said, look, I'm out of it. I'm not going to have anything to do with it, and, goodbye. And he said, well, okay, if you ever change your mind, he says, I'm a real estate appraiser, and I'll trade you an appraisal for your tapes. Well, that meant something to me because I needed a loan, and I needed a second mortgage on my house. I said, okay, look, you do that, and I'll give you everything I have. So I started copying all my stuff and got it all ready from him, and we made a appointment. He comes over with this guy, and he says, I have my helper here. We're going to measure your house. And we start talking. Turns out this guy's name is Bob Lazar. So as Gene and I are talking about saucers and Billy Myers and MJ-12 and all this stuff, this guy is rolling his eyes, and he can't make it plain enough that he thinks we're absolutely nuts. And so Gene says, look, this guy worked at Los Alamos National Labs. He's a scientist. He was a scientist there. He thinks we're nuts because he said if there was anything there that he would have known about it. And then Bob says, yeah, look, he said, I had the highest clearance. He said, I was the nosiest. I poked around everywhere. He said, if there was anything to this, I would have known about it. Didn't we hear that from Ned Day? So anyway, that was like in the June or July of '88. Over the next 3 or 4 months, we started giving Bob Lazar information. And he was receptive. He said, okay, well, I'll look at it. And one or two, I think there was three things that really tipped him over. And one was the YY-2 secret address that we had at Los Alamos. And the fact that we knew about it and he didn't. And the other was, I forget what the three things, the grudge reports, he did find those, that were not supposed to exist. And there was a third one, I forget what it was. But anyway, around October, he had decided to re-enter the scientific community to find out if this was true. And that's when he called Dr. Teller at Lawrence Livermore in California and said, I want to re-enter the scientific community. And Teller says, do you want to work there in Nevada or work here in California with me? And Bob said, I want to work at Area 51. And Teller says, let me see what I can do. That's when Bob got the 3 interviews at EG&G. And I even have a typewritten piece of paper of the second interview because he came over here, because the first question on the second interview was, do you know John Lear, and what do you think about John Lear? And Bob says, the way I answered that question was, yes, I know John Lear, and I think he sticks his nose into places where it doesn't belong. And Bob said, what I didn't tell them is I also like to stick my nose into places it doesn't belong.
You would think that would be an automatic disqualifier for someone to work in a program out there, no matter what the program.
And that's why I've always had this secret fear that Bob was brought into the program, as the first part of a disclosure of what was going on, and we were supposed to tell what was going on. There's so many little teeny hints. For instance, the first night he went there, December 6th, and he came back to my house and told me what was going on. I mean, they followed him. I mean, and then when Bob was telling me about it, he said, I can't volunteer information, but I can answer your questions. And, it was like it was a setup, and it's never been resolved in my mind whether or not, it was a setup. Now, I know this, or I feel all the stuff he told me was true, so the question is, were they purposely trying to get this information out?
What did you think about him when you first met him? What was your impression of him as a person? Smart guy?
Smart guy, and, he handed me his resume. His resume did have it was a 8.5 by 11 little folder, and it did have the MIT and the Caltech degrees in there. Now, I had that resume. I kept it. It disappeared. I can't explain why there's no records of his schooling. I can't explain why MIT doesn't have any records. I do know that he went to MIT when he was working in Los Alamos.
There are those who wonder if these two men were working with the government on some sort of a trial balloon, a psychological exercise to see whether or not a release of information about government knowledge of the ET reality might cause a panic. All those theories have floated around over the years. We're going to come back with John Lear in just a minute and ask him each one of those one by one, as well as his relationship with Lazar, how it developed, how this story unfolded, a story that is now known all over the world. I'm George Knapp on Coast to Coast AM. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp, your guest host. My guest this evening, John Lear, the one and only. John, we've been talking about Area 51, Bob Lazar, how you two first met and how you sort of debriefed Bob about UFOs in general and the cover-up. You've heard the theories that I just discussed in that previous to that break about all the things that have been said about you and about Bob and what you two were really up to over the years. Let's go through them. I'd like to give you the chance to answer some of these things. The fact that you guys were working in cahoots together to cook this whole thing up. What do you think?
Sounds good, but first I want you to say hello to my friends at AboveTopSecret.com.
Hello, friends at AboveTopSecret.com.
Thanks, George.
All right. Tell me about, you've heard all those statements about you and Bob and who was playing whom and whether you're working in cahoots for the government and things of that sort. The idea that you created him, that you putting him up to this. Let's deal with that one first.
Well, I don't know how to answer that. I know nothing about physics. I wasn't the one that told us about gravity A and gravity B. Those are two real things. Bob Lazar gave us those. I don't think it's been released yet, but when scientists do release what gravity really is, and it doesn't have nothing to do with gravitons, and there is two gravity waves, gravity A and gravity B. One works on an atomic scale, and one works on a larger scale. I didn't invent that. Also, I didn't invent the element 115. And the properties and how it works and how it's stable at 115 but unstable at 116. And the reaction giving off the antimatter and the access to the gravity A wave, which allows travel, at hundreds of times the speed of light. So I didn't, Bob was the one that learned that up at S4, so...
The idea that both of you did this as a disinformation plot to distract attention away from something else that was going on up there, I've heard that one more often in ufological circles over the years, and it seems to be the prevailing view among the UFO hierarchy that it was a disinformation plan to distract attention from something else up there, which I've always thought if that were the plan, that was a really stupid plan, because by saying there are flying saucers up there, he created an international sensation, drew tens of thousands of people. They're still going out there to look at whatever it is that's flying around out in the skies above central Nevada.
I agree.
And, yeah.
I agree 100%. I mean, if it was a disinformation, they did the wrong thing.
You mentioned something a couple of minutes ago before the break that you said that in the back of your head you've always had the thought that maybe you were played by Bob, that he really was working with them. I mean, how much credibility do you give that possibility?
No, what I meant to say was that I was being played by the people up at the test site through Bob, that they wanted the information released, and they used Bob to come to me because I was the UFO guy, and was supposed to release it.
What could be the reason for something like that if that scenario were true? How does it make sense?
There was a lot of guys that wanted the information out, and when I first started this, George, I knew some guys, not particularly at Groom Lake, but I knew some test site guys. I flew for Dynelectron, and I flew that B-26 and the OV-10 and the Huey and that Turbine Beach that was out there on Patrick, that old hangar they had out there on Patrick Lane, and I'd fly around there around the underground nuke tests, and what I do is my job is, depending on what airplane I was flying, was if the nuke test vented, we were supposed to pick up samples of it, and bring it back. And one of the other things I did is before the nuke test, I'd fly around the outside perimeter of the test site and between 5,000 and 15,000 feet and take wind direction and speed and radio it down. And I knew a lot of the guys there. I also had a little gun shop called Special Weapons on Maryland Parkway in Trop, and a lot of the guys would drop in. Also, I knew the chief test pilot of Special Projects. He flew with me over in Laos. I knew a lot of those guys. So, every once in a while I'd get a little teeny tidbit of information, and that's why I thought that it might be something like that. There was another guy that hung around a lot. His name was Jerry Myers, and I met him through the Confederate Air Force, and he gave me a few tips. That was a really interesting little scenario that went on. But the most important thing, George, is during that time, and I'm talking about 87, 88, and part of 89, because it pretty much all stopped after the Lazar thing came about, people would come to my door. Now, I was an airline pilot, and I was away most of the time, but you know that I live here up on Sunrise, and people would come up and knock on the door. My wife would answer it, and they'd say, I can't give you my name. I wanted to tell you that your husband is right, that I work up in those black areas. And I can't tell you how many times that happened. And people were trying to get the information out. So whether that was the story or not, I don't know. I know that there's been attempts to get the information out, that there are people that know that we were much further along in technology. Right now, we're 50 years ahead, and there's no reason why we can't have some of it. but but it's not being done. So that's why I give credibility to some of those who say, well, maybe Lear and Lazar were used as kind of conduits trying to get the information out. The only difference would be they call it disinformation, but it was real information.
I think a lot of people, as I mentioned, in the UFO circles, certainly the UFO hierarchy, have dismissed the story. They no longer believe it. They're open to the idea that maybe we had some technology out there. They just don't want to believe Bob because of the problems in verifying his credentials and academic credentials in particular, work history, things like that. I tell them, when we have conversations, look, I know it's a hard thing to swallow. It's a hard story to believe. It's much easier to dismiss it because of all the things that have happened. But you don't know because you didn't live through it. That was a weird time. There were some weird things that happened that shed light on the veracity of this story. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. You have nailed that. That time between 1987, 88, 89, the stuff that was going on in Vegas that you and I knew about, that girl that got murdered in her apartment over the Area 51 deal, remember that?
Yes.
Just stuff like that was going on continually. And, for people who didn't live here, they didn't live through that, so they weren't involved in it on a day-to-day basis like you and I were.
For the thing about the credentials, that's the problem that people have about Bob, and so many people have done the same steps that we did in the beginning and found out, well, he doesn't have any record at MIT or Caltech. They're not there. They find out the same thing later and think they've got a big expose or something, when in fact that information was presented in the very first story we aired about Bob. But explain to me how it would work that a guy like him could get hired up there. It's question about what his clearances were. Even if you buy the idea that he went to MIT or Caltech, he's an interesting character with a lot of different kinds of interests. The interest in the legal brothel, the jet cars, the pirate flag that would fly on top of his house, the desert blast events, and making his own fireworks. I mean, you can see a lot of reasons why people would worry about having him work at a place like that, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. And I think that, one of the things when you hire into a program like that and you don't have a long history of being with the government, and they're going to upgrade you in a couple of months to the highest clearance level in the United States, one thing they want to make damn sure is that they have a way to discredit you instantly if anything goes wrong. They're going to make that brothel known. They're going to, make the fact that you don't have any education credentials. They're going to have all that in place first. So if anything goes wrong, they can instantly dump you or discredit you.
Well, that's one of the things that people say. Well, if this program were true, they'd have scientist XYZ because guys like that are much more credible than somebody like Bob. But in fact, when you look at it through that prism, Bob may have been the most qualified guy in the world for that program because he's technically brilliant, knows a lot about science, knows a lot about mechanics and electronics and things of that sort, but he certainly would be an easy target to discredit.
Absolutely. He had a broad education. He knew a lot of things about a lot of different things, and that's why when they went through when they weren't for the first two interviews, and then he got the third interview, they probably decided, hey, this is the kind of guy we need up there.
Did he tell you right off the bat when he got hired, or did he wait a while?
No, the last thing I knew before he went up there was the second interview, and that's the stuff I have typed up when he came in and he said they wanted to know about you, and there was 3 or 4 other things. I wish I had that piece of paper, but I don't have it right there. He got a third interview that he didn't tell me about. Now, the first time he went up there was December 6th. Now, he has that on that log he kept, that calendar he always kept on his wall.
Right.
Every year, and he put, that was the flight to nowhere. Well, I looked up in my logbook, and I was gone then. So it must have been either the second time he went up there, because I don't have a record of when he first came up here, but it had to be like the 8th or 9th, maybe the second week in December. And that's when he came in the evening, like about 7 or 8 o'clock, And I'm sitting there, writing checks or something, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I saw a disc today." And I thought I didn't hear him. I said, "What?" He said, "I saw a disc today." And I said, "Theirs or ours?" And he said, "Theirs." I said, "You went to Area 51?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Then what are you doing here?" I said, "Why don't you learn what's going on up there?" I said, "They might have followed you here, and, you won't get to go up there again." And here's exactly what Lazar said. He said, "John, you have taken so much crap over the last year that I have seen that you deserve to know that it's true. I saw it. I touched it. They're real."
Well, in that sense, then he violated a security oath pretty early in the going.
Exactly, but the thing is, and in part of that conversation, he said, "I'm allowed to tell you, I'm not allowed to volunteer anything, but I can answer questions."
No kidding. So, and did he keep you appraised after subsequent events up there? Did he give you little briefings?
Yeah, he'd come over and tell me. For instance, it's been told 100 million times, and I'll just tell it again. And the night, it was in January, and I know January, it was really cold. I had on a short sleeve shirt. He comes in. We no longer talked openly in my den because we knew it was being recorded somehow. And I forget what the story is like that, but he gave me the high sign. And so we walked outside. You know how my den has a back door and it goes by the pool, and you walk out by that back gate, where the stable is.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
So Bob and I walk out there, and my wife is by the pool. He says, and she's always suspicious of what me and Bob are up to, because we're always getting in trouble. So she says, "Where are you guys going?" And I said, "Oh, we're just going to go out in the backyard for a second." So we went out that big wooden gate, and Bob stood right there, and he denies this, to this day, but this is exactly what happened. This is exactly the way I remember it. His eyes were shining brightly. He was alive. He had something to tell me of great importance. And I said, What? And he said, "John, you will never know what it's like to see your first live alien." I said, "You saw it for sure?" He said, "Yes." I said, "It wasn't a doll or a puppet?" "No, I saw him." And then he told me, he's walking down the hallway, guards on both sides. He comes by this door. There's a 12-inch by 12-inch window that had the wires through it. He looked through the window, and there's two scientists in lab coats facing him, with one of the grays facing away from him, talking to the guys in lab coats. Now, Bob denies his story this day. He says, something like, "Well, I told John I saw something," and he said, "Oh, that's an alien, that's an alien." That's not the way it happened, George. The way it happened is the way I just told you. So that's fine if Bob wants to deny it. I can understand why he would, having taken so much flack, but that's the truth as I remember it.
Then in March of 1989,
March 21st is when he was making the doggy death ray. And the doggy death ray was my wife had some dogs, and we had just I had just made her a little Japanese garden, and they were digging up the garden. So Bob said, "Well, let me make a high-pitched tone so that it'll keep the dogs away." And we nicknamed it the doggy death ray. So that whole day, March 21st, he worked on this little doggy death ray. It was just a little amplifier. And towards the end of the day, he said, "They're going to test fly tomorrow. Do you want to go see it?" And I said, "Test fly what?" And he said, "One of the saucers." And I said, "Yeah, how can we do it?" And he said, "There's a back road into Groom Lake," which I knew about because I'd already driven it. He said, "We can go down that." And I said, "We can see it from there?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "How do you know it's going to be tomorrow night?" And he said, "It's always on Wednesday night, just at dusk." And I said, "Great." So the next night, Gene Huff and me and Bob, they showed up at my house because we were going to take my motor home. And Jackie was with us. And we loaded up the motorhome, and I think we left, about maybe 6 o'clock. We drove up Highway 15, got off at 93, went up 93, went through Alamo, turned left on 375, and we're just halfway up that summit when the transmission gave out. And Bob said, "Hey, you ever think about putting any transmission fluid in this? And I said, I don't think I have. So Gene Huff got out and hitchhiked back down to Alamo, got some transmission fluid, came back, we poured it in, and it worked. And we came up top of the hill. Now it was about it was about 8:30, and we drove down the Groom Lake Road, parked, and got all our stuff. And at 8:45 is when the light came up. Now it's just a light. You couldn't see it was a saucer. It started jumping around the skies, and I'm trying to set up that 8-inch Celestron scope. And when I finally get it lined up, the saucer is descending behind the mountains, and I got a good 15-second look at it as it's descending, and I've described it. It was a disc oriented about 30 degrees to the rise, and it was like flowing. Something was flowing it off in a gold or orange substance, and it was a flying saucer.
A dark side of some of the things that happened at the world's best-known secret base, Area 51. John, you were talking about, we've been talking about the reputation of Bob Lazar and how it's kind of been shredded in the eyes of many people over the years. And, they will look at his lack of provable educational credentials, things of that sort. What they always seem to bounce over or gloss over are the things that he knew that have been proven true. And the most important of those probably is the fact that there were test flights of flying saucers on Wednesday nights at Area 51. You know this because you went out there with him several times yourself, or 3 times yourself, and with other people, and saw them and videotaped them. I guess the question is, how did he know this otherwise? Because when this was happening, few people outside of Nevada had ever heard of Area 51, let alone know that there were test flights of flying saucers on Wednesday evenings.
Yeah, well, I hear that, maybe Bob was at Groom Lake, but he might have been a cook. I said, well, if he was a cook, then they were telling the cooks when the saucers flew. It's hilarious what some of the things that people come up. But I just got a call from GoofOn.
Oh, Gene Huff.
Yeah. Now, we got to explain to everybody that we all had nicknames, and because all of the UFO things were like MUFON and KUFON and stuff like that, we all became UFON. So Bob became BUFON, Gene Huff became GoofOn, and I didn't have a UFON. I was the captain until Bill Cooper came out with his statement about being the Condor, and then my nickname became Condor.
And I was Newfon, I think, back in those days.
Yeah.
We were talking before the break about going out there, and you saw this flight of a flying disc, a glowing object. You saw it through a telescope the first time. Second time you videotaped it, right?
No, the second night was the following. That was the following Wednesday, and that was March 29th. And that was the night that, or the day before, I had to go to Minneapolis on a flight with American Transair. And Tuesday night is when I called Bob from my hotel, and I said, what's going on? And he said, we're going fishing tomorrow night. And, meaning they're going to go to Groom Lake. So I missed that night, but that's the night that Jim Taliani went. And that was the night that somebody filmed it and got Jim Taliani on the audio, and that's why he got fired from Tonopah Test Range. The third night was April 6th, the following, the third Wednesday night, and that's the night that me, Gene, Bob, and Jackie and Jackie's sister went. And the motorhome had was down for maintenance, so we had to rent a car, and we put all this stuff in the trunk, the Geiger counter and the video camera and everything. And we start driving down this road about 8:30, and we're going further and further. I said, look, there's no point in going any further. We can't get more than a mile further. Why don't we just stop and set up the camera? So before we got stopped, we saw the lights of a couple of Jeeps in front of us, or security vehicles, and we were apprehensive, and so I said, okay, well, let's get out of here. And I was riding right seat, and I told Jackie's sister, who was driving, I said, now be careful around turning around here because we don't want to get caught on this road. So we go whizzing down this road, this dirt road, in the middle of the night, flying dust with the security vehicles chasing us. We get about three-quarters of the way to 375, the paved road, and Bob says, look, stop. They're going to catch us. I can't afford to get caught. Let's stop. I'll get out, and you guys talk with them, and when they leave, I'll get back in. So we stopped. Bob jumped out, ran into the desert, and he took a 9mm with him. I don't know what he was going to do with that. Bob, he was crazy anyway. So I start getting the telescope out of the back of the trunk and setting it up when the security vehicles slid to a stop. And so I went up and I threw my hands on the top of their, I made a slamming motion on top of one of the vehicles. And I said, holy smokes, you guys scared us. And they said, why is that? And I said, we thought you might be dopers. And they said, no, we aren't dopers. We need to see some ID and get some information. And they got out of their truck. They had the guns, and they kind of circled around us, and they took the information. And they said, we can't kick you off here because this is BLM land, and you have, a right to be here, but we don't want you here. So we'd appreciate it. You save yourselves a lot of trouble if you'll just leave. So they got in their car, turned around, and left. And we're standing there in the desert with the trunk lid open with a light. And Bob comes out of the desert about 10 minutes later, and we all start laughing and joking and talking about flying saucers. And Bob says, yeah, I was over there. I said I had one of the security guards' head lined up. If he came towards me, I was going to blow him away, and all this. And all the time we didn't realize that the security guys didn't go very far. They just went out of our range of seeing and turned around and were filming us and recording what we were saying. So after about 10 minutes of all that, we put the telescope back in the trunk. We all got in the car, and we started to head home. Well, we no sooner got onto the paved portion of the highway when the lights and sirens of the police of the sheriff vehicle came on, and their bullhorn, get out of the car and put your hands on top of the car, and da-da-da-da-da. So we all get out of the car, put our hands on top of the car, and there's me and Jean and Jackie and her sister and Bob. And the guy's name was Doug Lamoureux. Do you remember him?
I sure do.
So Doug says, and at that time, that was when we first met Doug, and he was a sweet guy. He was a neat guy, but of course we didn't know that. He was playing Mr. Sheriff, and he says, okay, he says, I got two questions. He said, number one, I want to know where the 9mm is, and number two, I want to know why there's 5 people in this vehicle now, and when security checked you 15 minutes ago, there was only 4 people. So it was amazing, George. I mean, for 1 solid hour, we hemmed and hawed, and nobody said anything. And Doug kept saying, all I have to do is go into town, get a search warrant, come back here and pound your car and toss you guys in. I need the answer to those 2 questions. Well, we never answered the question, and 1 hour later, Doug came up to us, and he said, okay, here's the deal. What I've been told, and I don't know why I've been told this, I've been told to let you guys go. Now, I don't want to see you back here again. So he let us go. We got in the car, went on home, and the next morning is the morning that Dennis Mariana called up Bob and said, I don't want you to go to the airport today. I'm going to pick you up and go from there. And that's when he took Bob to Indian Springs, which is the head of all security for the test site and the Nellis Range. And that's when they took Bob out, according to Bob, with a gun in his ear and took him into that little building and said, now, Bob, when we gave you clearance to work on these flying saucers, it didn't mean you were supposed to tell all your friends about them. Now, do you want to work here or not? And Bob says he was non-committal because he didn't know whether he wanted to work there or not. And,
I'm going to have to stop you there for a second, John. We need to take a short break again, but I want to continue this fascinating story. It sure brings back some memories for us. My name is George Knapp. I'm with John Lear here on Coast to Coast AM. Stick around. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp. We're joined by our special guest, John Lear. We're talking about the early days of the Area 51 legend, specifically recapping a story about how John Lear accompanied Bob Lazar and a couple of other folks on trips out to Groom Lake to personally witness flights of what sure looked a heck of a lot like a flying saucer on subsequent weeks in 1989. And on the last trip, of course, you got popped essentially, and then Bob got called onto the carpet, John. And then his life sort of went into a tailspin after that. He agreed to do an interview with us, in shadow, shot out in front of your house, a live interview with, we used the term Dennis, which was the name of his boss out at Area 51 or S4. And then after that, boy, it really hit the fan, didn't it?
Yeah. And two things here. Number one is I already had you say hello to AboveTopSecret.com, right?
Yes.
Okay. Goofon just called again, and I wanted to tell you what he said. He said you know that calendar I said that Bob kept?
Yes.
He said that he has it, and he's amazed at how accurate my dates are. And he's going to try and call in later.
Great, good.
He says that's amazing. He says, I'm really enjoying this because, I don't know how he can remember those dates. And I said, because I have to tell the story every day.
Well, you lived through some of these events. A lot of folks think that Bob exaggerated the things that happened to him, that it never could have happened. Nobody shot out his tires. People weren't breaking into his home, but you lived through it. I was around for a lot of that stuff, and it sure as heck looked like a lot of that really did occur.
Right. Now, remember on Sunday, we did the third on-the-record interview.
Right.
And that was the week after Bob got caught at the test site. Okay, so you called me the next morning and you said, John, the phone is ringing off the hook. What can we do for an encore? And I said, let me see if Bob is ready to spill the beans. And so I called Bob and I said, George wants to do an interview. What do you think? He said, as long as I'm in shadow. So I called you back and you said, yeah, you could send the truck up to my house. As a matter of fact, I have the video of us doing that. And he wanted to be called Dennis, which was a inside joke on Dennis Mariana, who he worked for. And you sent the truck up here and we did that interview that night. And I mean, all heck broke loose after that interview. And we did that in my driveway. And so I can't remember it was the next night or a few nights after that. It was actually in the afternoon. Bob came over to my house, and he was he was beside himself. I'd never seen him look so unhappy. I said, what happened? He said, I just had my tire shot out. And I said, what happened? He said, I was just turning onto the Highway 15 from Charleston, and he said the guys came up behind me and shot the tires out, or one tire out. And I said, did you see him? And he said, no, I couldn't see anything. I pulled over, changed the tire, and I drove over here. And he said, look, I'm going to turn myself in. I said, to who? And I said, don't do that. And so that was the night that Bob stayed on my couch because he didn't want to go home.
The break-ins at his house, those were real, weren't they?
The what?
He had break-ins at his home where people would go in and leave all the doors and windows open.
Yeah. And I can't remember. Refresh my memory if Goofon would call in. He can remember when we got to 115. I think it was a couple of weeks after that. Do you remember?
I don't, but we can recap for our listeners. 115 is what Lazar claimed was the fuel, basically, that powered the reactor that launched these flying saucers that were out at S4, which is an area, Papoose Dry Lake Bed, where he said he worked in an underground hidden facility, and they had 9 of these flying saucers stashed there. 115, of course, at the time that Bob first mentioned it, didn't exist. It has since been synthesized in a very small amount, and it didn't have very much of a half-life. So it's not exactly as stable as he described it, but in conversations I've had with him in recent years, he says that he still believes that there could be some sort of an isotope of 115 that could be made stable. You know much about that, John? Yeah,
it only occurs naturally, and it can occur naturally in our solar system anyway, and they can't synthesize it, at least to what he had. Now, when he and I and Joe Vananitti did the experiment, what we did was we took a piece of dry ice and we put a bell jar over the dry ice. We put the 115 on the dry ice, and then we took a Coleman lantern mantle, which would release radioactive alpha rays, which were supposed to shoot off into space at the speed of light, and we watched them. And the reason we did the dry ice, it would form a fog inside this bell jar, and we could see the alpha particles being sucked back down into the 115. And basically, what Bob was trying to show us was the attractive properties of the 115.
You know, after that, I mean, all the stuff that happened to Bob, and he had personal problems and legal troubles and things of that sort, and in the views of many, he's been discredited, and they've discredited the whole story out there. But in spite of that, a lot of people still believe him, and the effect on that area, Rachel and Area 51, has just been mind-boggling, isn't it for you? I mean, could you have ever imagined that Area 51 would become a household name all over the world, that it would spawn so many cottage industries? I mean, not just T-shirts and trinkets and ashtrays and things like that, and bumper stickers and posters, but there are rock bands named Area 51. There's a rock band named Element 115, some folks from Phoenix who are pretty talented. There have been bars named Area 51, and then there's the Little Alien and the E.T. Highway, and video games and movies and books and screenplays and documentaries and news coverage from all over the world. Did you ever imagine it would be this big?
No, and it's crazy when you think about how back in those days, you know, it was Gene Huff and Bob Lazar and you and me, and that was it. And we were trying to get a story out, and just look at, and just imagine how long that was ago. That's been 20 years ago. You know, people, weren't even born that are real interested in that stuff, and that happened to us.
Makes you wish you had a piece of the action, though.
Yeah, it does.
You had some adventures with Bob where you traveled to Los Alamos. That's another knock on him. He claimed to work at Los Alamos in sensitive positions, and folks, it took me a couple of years to get them to finally admit that they had a record that he was in fact there after they denied it for so long. What were the circumstances of you and Bob going to Los Alamos for?
Bob had a contract to repair alpha probes for Los Alamos, and there was about 300 of them, and about every 6 weeks we'd drive there, and it took about 14 hours to get there, and we'd set up a kitchen table at a kitchen table of a friend's house, and we'd repair these alpha probes, and it took about anywhere from 16 to 20 hours, and we'd strip them first, and then then he'd put the wire in them, and I'd put the aluminum cover on them, and it just took a long time to do. And then when we were done, he'd put them in a box, put the bill there, we'd jump in the car and drive back to Las Vegas. When he started making a little money, he started taking an airplane or airline. And since I had jump seat privileges, I'd just get on the jump seat of the airplane, and we'd go together, get to Albuquerque, rent the car, drive up to Los Alamos, fix the probes, and come back. Well, this one time we did it. We jumped, got it, the Hertz rent-a-car, got into it, drove to Los Alamos, and everything went just perfect, and we finished all 300 probes at 8 hours. And we had enough time to get back to Albuquerque, get on the airplane, and come back and have dinner at Parma's. So we go racing down the hill from Los Alamos, 100 miles an hour. We get to the Hertz rent-a-car place, turn in the car, get the bus to the airport. We go running up the steps. Bob runs into the jetway on the airplane. I get my pass at the counter, jump seat pass, run onto the airplane. They shut the door, and we're starting to push back. And I heard the pilot say, welcome aboard Southwest Airlines 453 to Los Angeles. And I'm thinking, oh, no, I got on the wrong airplane. And, of course, Bob is pushing back on the airplane to Las Vegas, and he's wondering, where's John?
This possibility of whether or not they messed with his mind. You'll recall that he told a story about drinking some kind of a liquid that tasted like pine, and he had intimidation tactics and threats that were used on him. Do you think it's possible that they planted any of this stuff in his head, seeing the alien, that sort of thing?
It's possible. I got to admit that, but I think he saw it. By the way, Gufon called, and he wanted me to remind you that we have a minor league baseball team named the Area 51.
That's right. The Las Vegas, the AAA affiliate of the Los Angeles Dodgers is the 51s. In fact, I'll put in another plug. This year, every year on the birthday of Nevada, they have a big parade up in our capital of Carson City. This year's theme is Area 51. And guess who the Grand Marshal is? That would be me. Anyway,
fantastic. And I wanted to tell all my friends at the Nighthawk Zone and Fantastic Forum, I know you've heard these stories before, but this is the first time I've had a chance to tell it with George, who was there when it was all happening.
All right. Well, tell me this. Do you believe that Bob's life was in danger back during that period, that it was legitimately in danger?
Well, that's the thing, and that's the thing that Bob said on his on that one videotape that you did that nobody has seen. Very few people have seen. As a matter of fact, I played it the other night for a friend of mine, where he says, look, if you're going to kill somebody, you do it, especially a big organization like that. You don't threaten them. You don't say, we're going to kill you. You just do it. And they never did. So what was the deal?
Bottom line on the story, John, how much of it do you still believe? How much of it still rings true for you?
110%.
Tell me this, do you still keep tabs on what goes on out at test site, Area 51, Tonopah Range? How closely?
I'm right on top of it.
I don't know if you saw...
As on top as you could be, because after 1990, whoever is in charge of secrecy at the government, they found out how to keep a secret. Nobody ever came to my house again, and it's been really hard finding out information, but I still have sources, and I'm pretty much on top of what's going on out there.
You think that the legal troubles that Bob got into, whether or not the government was related to that the message was driven home, that they used that situation to say, see what can happen to you if you spill your guts?
You mean recently or back then?
Back then.
Yeah, I think that was, I think that whole brothel thing was some kind of mind control, because I remember asking Bob when he was setting it up for the girl, what was her name? You remember the girl's name?
It's escaping me right now.
Anyway, when he was setting up, I said, Bob, look, this is insane. I mean, they're going to find out about this. Why are you doing this? And he said, I just, it's something I want to do. It didn't make sense at the time. It doesn't make sense now. And, of course, everybody found out about it. And, for those who didn't know Bob, it totally discredited him. But, the fact is I was right there and I saw it happen. So it was a different story for me.
Let's talk about Area 51 now and the test site. Of course, we broke a story earlier this month about this gigantic new hangar that's going in out there at Area 51. It was there's photos of this can be seen online at a couple of places at dreamlandresort.com, also at lazyranch.com. Photos taken from miles away, but they're really great photos. Something really big. We don't know what's going in there. It would be just pure speculation to guess about it, but it looks like maybe it might be another secret plane of some sort. You have any guesses yourself?
Well, Area 51, Groom Lake, is a low-level place now. There are certainly secret projects that go on, but in 1989, 1990, a lot of the secret stuff moved up to Idaho, just about 45 minutes out of Twin Falls. And the main new secret base that they're using Groom Lake to cover, they're letting everybody see it. The real place is Sandia. And Sandia is located halfway between Tonopah Test Range and Groom Lake. There's 3 or 4 runways there, huge hangars. Part of Sandia extends up on the Paiute Mesa. There's massive underground facilities, which includes places for people to live, and it's a huge place, but it's kept real secret. It was built between 1980 and 1987. It was opened in 1987. It's 20 years old now. I have friends that not only work there, but helped build it. I had friends that helped build the runway. It's a massive place, but you don't hear about it very much. Groom Lake is used as a place where now they take senators and congressmen and say, we're going to let you in on all this really secret stuff. And, that's how they get their appropriations is showing them stuff. So the people who look at Area 51 and think there's anything really, really secret going on there, they're wrong. I mean, there is a lot of secret stuff going on that's far, far beyond Area 51.
Well, what's your guess about what's going on at Tonopah Test Range at the Sandia site you just mentioned?
There is a lot of new aircraft. People look at the F-22 and they think that's a state-of-the-art and all the rest of the stuff. We have stuff that, is just amazing. The cover-up is so well done, and there's so many levels of it that people it would boggle their mind. I know of at least 3 major bases around the state of Nevada that are on dry lakes that are underground that, I don't think they even have permission from BLM to put it there. And, Google is regularly photoshopped by the military. There's no chance of finding anything on Google or any other satellite imagery place. It's all photoshopped by the military.
You've heard the stories about an SR-72, about an Aurora, about Black Manta, about any number of other programs. Do you think those things, any of those or all of those, are real and that they might be being test flown out at some of the facilities you've just mentioned?
Absolutely, they were real 30 years ago. Bob saw the Aurora, in 1988 or 1989. There's tremendous strides being made in secret aircraft, but we don't get to hear about it anymore. But
and UAVs?
UAVs, yeah,
yes,
being flown out of Creech.
Creech, yes.
Air Force Base, which is the new name for Indian Springs.
Right. I had heard that they might have insect-sized UAVs that they're flying around out there somewhere.
George, they have all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's just amazing what they have that we don't know about.
And would you say that some of these new advanced technologies, aircraft, are based on things that they learned from the saucers that were there at S4?
Certainly. Certainly a lot of that is stuff that they learned, but, our technology is so advanced. Let me take you a step further. In 1962, remember I told you the saucer or the anti-grav technology had been perfected in 1958?
Yes.
Our first trip to the moon was in 1962. Our first trip to Mars was in 1966. We've explored most of the solar system by now, and we've probably gone to the stars. Everything that you've seen or read about Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the Space Lab, the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station is all cover. It's $100 billion cover-up for what's really going on. As fantastic as that sounds, when I first talked about, flying saucers, you had trouble believing it then. The stuff that I'm telling you is real. I mean, we have bases on the moon. People live there. We've been to Mars. I've made some really good contacts, and that's what's going on.
You're going to have to go back on the UFO circuit, John, to tell those stories. We're going to take another short break. When we come back, we'll have another 15 minutes one-on-one with you to talk about disinformation and other topics. And then at the top of the hour, we're going to open it up to our phone line. So stick around. I'm George Knapp on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp, guest host, and my guest tonight is John Lear. We're talking about Area 51 and a lot of other related topics. John, I want to touch on on something that's sort of a sore spot in ufology, in ufological circles, and that's the idea of disinformation. You know, whenever some ufologist gets mad at some other ufologist, he accuses him of being a disinformation agent, and it's kind of like the equivalent of saying your mama, something like that. You've been accused of...
Yeah, that sure happened a lot with Bill Cooper and the rest of the guys.
You've been accused of it. I've been accused of it. Bob Lazar's been accused of it. You made that accusation yourself a long time ago about a guy named Bill Moore. And, Bill Moore's done a lot of good, solid work in ufology, particularly on the Roswell case. But you wrote in that 1987 paper that you thought Bill Moore was a government agent. And, in fact, it turned out 2 years later he admitted he was working with some disinformation people. How did you know?
I forget how I knew that, but yeah, he was working on. He was running the Benowitz deal with Doty, and I don't remember how I knew he was a disinformation agent.
Did you have any involvement with what happened to Paul Benowitz, or were you monitoring that? Were you aware of it as it was going on?
You know, when I heard about the Benowitz deal, I went to Albuquerque. I stayed with him for 2 nights. I got briefed by him. He's the one that gave me the X-ray of Judy Doherty that had the little thing in her neck. That ended up with Ron Regier, and Ron Regier says he doesn't remember what happened to it. But anyway, I got the original story that Jim McCampbell wrote about the Judy Doherty abduction, about Dulcie. That's when we got the confirmation that Dulcie existed. When I was at the Crestone meeting, Adams, I forget what his first name was, who gave me the note of the contact at Henderson, who had been given one of the boxes to be hidden by the security guard at Dulcie. Dulcie is a real sore spot with a lot of people. They can't believe that there's an underground base there that's co-jointly occupied by the U.S. military and aliens, but in fact it's true. And this one security guard, I think his name was, I can't remember, Costello or something like that, and he knew the person in Henderson that I did. And subsequent to that, and I learned about that before I met Bob, when Bob got read the briefings at S4, he read about the altercation in which the 44 Delta Force and the scientists were killed. Now, it didn't specifically say Dulcie. He got the impression it was Area 51, but his clearance may have been not at the level to hear about Dulcie yet. But in fact, the altercation in which the 44 people were killed was at Dulcie.
We were mentioning about Bill Moore in 1989 at a MUFON symposium held here in Las Vegas, the first one I ever attended. He startled everyone by admitting that he had worked with AFOSI guys regarding Paul Benowitz, basically drove the guy over the edge. Bill Moore's explanation was that he knew these guys were disinformation experts, psych war operatives, and that he was working with them because he wanted to know more about what these guys were up to. And so that's why he cooperated. Tell me this, how much legitimate, real disinformation on the part of the government, operations like that, black operations to disrupt and muddy the waters, do you think is going on?
A lot of it. A lot of it. I can't tell you exactly what. When I talk and tell people about, my experiences, I tell them exactly what happened to me. And, I don't know for sure, whether Benowitz knew exactly what was going on, but he certainly knew about Dulcie, and he knew about Archuleta Mesa, and he's the one that went up there with Gabe Valdez, and they're the ones that found the part of the wreckage of the black airplane that crashed up there. There was too many things that happened to Benowitz that he could prove for Bill Moore to say that it was a disinformation campaign. Not to mention the fact that I spent at least several days with Colonel Ernie Edwards, who backed up Benowitz.
In ufology, you get paranoid. You stick around it long enough, and you start seeing disinformation agents under every rock. And it makes me wonder how much there really is, because as you know, John, ufologists shoot themselves in the foot every chance they get. They're their own worst enemies. There's all the infighting that goes on. Everyone accuses everyone else of being full of it. You would think that the government wouldn't really have to work too hard to discredit the whole field because the ufologists do it for themselves.
That's a good analogy. That's great.
So do you think that there is actual infiltration of, say, UFO organizations anymore, or they have agents out there posing as ufologists?
I just don't know. It doesn't seem like they'd have to, does it?
No, not really. Let me get your take on this. One of the other things you mentioned in that original paper long ago was about cattle mutilations. You had mentioned about traveling down and conversing with Linda Moulton Howe, of course, who's done, the seminal work on this subject and really brought it to the fore years ago and continues to do so. What do you make of that? Because it's still going on. It doesn't seem to get much media coverage because they seem to have done a good job of passing on this story that it's coyotes or Satan worshipers or something. Well, what do you make of it?
I don't know. Linda and I drove from Albuquerque. We were going down to Roswell to see Clifford Stone. We went into Corona, and as we're going down that valley, we had these A7s that were doing low passes on my truck. And I stopped. I said, Linda, this is weird. Anyway, from Corona, we took that dirt road that goes over, that connects with the other road to Roswell, and I think it's like about 25 miles. You get halfway between it, and there's supposed to be a town on the map called Nan. We got there, and there's nothing there except 25 mutilated cows. And we started looking around. I said, this is crazy. How could I be driving a truck with Linda Moulton Howe and just happen to drive into 25 mutilated cows? So we drove south to where the original ranch was, where, what's his name? What was the guy that, the Roswell guy that found the
Brazel?
Yeah,
Matt
we drove down towards Brazel Ranch on this road, and we got to this rancher, and we said, what's the deal with all those cows? And he said, they have this infection, and the health department has told us to cordon off the area, and they're going to take care of it. And then Linda researched the story, and I don't remember what happened to that, but that was just weird. And yes, those cattle mutilations go on, so I don't know what it's all about.
Well, it's just so strange that whoever is doing it leaves the carcasses behind in such a oddly cut up way. Some that appear to have been used high heat instruments, the cord anus, the tongues and strips of flesh from the jaw. It just seems like perhaps the reason that the carcasses are left behind is to have the psychological effect, the unnerving effect of having them discovered by people. But I just can't figure out what the purpose of that would be.
Well, there's plenty of examples of them doing the same thing to humans. The B-52 that crashed in Vietnam that Clifford Stone investigated, that all those B-52 crew members, exact mutilations like you just described. Then the one in Alamogordo that was described in the Grudge 13 papers was exactly the same.
What's your take on the latest Roswell revelations? We see Walter Haut came out posthumously with his statement about the cover-up. It just seems like Roswell. That's a solid story, but it just seems like it's been so hopelessly polluted over the years by so many conflicting accounts. I'll tell you what, John. Before you answer that, we're going to have to take another short break. Welcome back, everyone. We have 1 hour left with our guest tonight, John Lear. Going to be taking your questions in just a moment, but I wanted to give John a chance to answer the question that we had to cut off from because of the break. John, about Roswell, there's so many arguments about was it one crash or two, where the location was, were there bodies or weren't there any bodies? Then you got 4 different versions coming out by the government. It seems like they keep lying about it, but muddying the waters. Do you think the Roswell story, the core of the story, still holds up? And what do you make about the newest revelations, Walter Haut's statements, posthumous statements, these 2 new books out, one by Jesse Marcel Jr. and the other by Don Schmidt? Are you up on it?
Yeah, I think that Roswell still holds up, and I think Jesse Marcel Jr. is telling the truth. I think Walter Haut is telling the truth. I don't know why the waters are muddied. I don't know why anybody would expect anything different. The Air Force is certainly going to not come and say, yeah, Walter Haut, yeah, well, that's what really happened. He caught us.
We're going to go to our lines now. We're going to first go to east of the Rockies. Melissa in Michigan has a question. Melissa, you there?
Yes. Hi, how are you guys this morning?
Good.
We're okay. What's on your mind?
John, I had a question for you. Back in 89, around 88, 89, I worked with my mom at a little department store, and there's a lady that used to come in there that we all thought was crazy, and my mom had pulled me aside one day and told me that she wasn't crazy, that she worked with the government on black ops projects, and when she came home, she was reprogrammed.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, why, do they feel they have to do that with people anymore? And could they have done things like that to Bob Lazar, put things in his mind, like you had said, to make him think that he was actually in them areas?
Absolutely. Programming is so advanced now. In the days of Bob Lazar, they were still using drugs. I don't know how they do it these days, but from what I've been able to find out, you can work on a project. You can actually walk inside a door, in a building, work on a project for like 30 or 40 minutes, walk outside that door, have no recollection of what you worked on, and not have it bother you. And so all this programming is really reached a very fine point.
Oh, I also just wanted to make a comment that the auroras do exist. I was in Northern California when I was in the military, and around, I'd say, March or April of 95, before I had gotten out, they had closed our SR-71 hangars, and our pilots were no longer to fly after dark, and all of our crew in the towers and everything were all sent home, and special people were brought in. And before I left, I was informed that those were the auroras back in the hangars.
Yeah, I have no doubt that time frame would be approximate. I think there were 7 auroras built. They were extremely loud. Bob saw them fly once. We had lots of other airplanes, but that story rings true. We shut down the SR-70 program in 1990 and started giving them to different museums, and I think there was only 3 left flying. The one we gave to Russia and 2 that NASA had. I'm not sure how many are flying today, but the story you tell just really rings true.
Well, I did with the U-2 project, and, just dealing with them and knowing some of the things that they had done was completely just amazing.
Yeah.
And, if the things that weren't going on today, I would go back in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Did you, Melissa, you never actually saw the aurora. You just heard of it when you were in the military?
We weren't allowed around there in the area past dark, but I lived just off the base where you could hear them fly above, because I didn't live anywhere near an airport. And you could hear them loud as, any airplane just like launching off. And it was just, it'd wake you up in the middle of the night if they flew close enough overhead of you.
And what part of California was this in?
I was in Beale Air Force Base.
Oh, at Beale. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Sure.
Yes. And that was out in the middle of nowhere, so you could actually go somewhere and, bring something there and nobody'd ever know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. They had the Blackbirds up there. Melissa, thank you
Right.
for the call. We're going to go to Bill west of the Rockies. Bill's in California. Bill, you there?
Yeah, I sure am. Good evening, gentlemen.
Howdy.
Hi. I'm a special effects artist. I'm sort of a regular to the show on other subjects, but I've had some time to discuss things with Robert Lazar a couple of times because of the projects that I've worked on in the past that involved the same kind of jet engine that he used in that jet-powered car of his. And I wanted to know if Bob Lear or you, George, or anybody knows about his connection with Eugene Gluharif. Has anybody heard that name?
Yes. Eugene was the guy that made the little flying saucer.
The little hovercraft.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Gene is actually, he was a engineer from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he's actually the guy who developed the jet engine that Bob used in that jet-powered car. What I'm trying to figure out, and what I haven't been able to reconcile to this day, is how somebody of the intelligence and the knowledge of Edward Teller would be attracted to that jet car to the point where it would qualify Bob to back engineer alien craft. We're talking about a burner that runs on propane from the stuff you use in your barbecue. These are not high-tech devices. As near as I can figure, what Bob came up with was a way to add an afterburner to that jet engine and create a little bit more thrust to push the car.
Yeah, but that wasn't the car that was in the story that Teller was reading. Teller was reading the little car that Bob had, and I forget whether it was a Toyota or
I think it was a Honda.
A Honda.
Yeah, it was a hatchback.
Right.
Yeah, I have pictures of that I got from Gene Gluharif before he passed away, and it is that Gluharif engine in there with some sort of a afterburner unit in the back of the thing. Then he cut a hole out where the license plate would go, and that's where the jet thrust comes out.
I don't think it's the technology of that is what impressed Teller. It just happened to be a coincidence that on the day that he was visiting Los Alamos, that story about Bob was in the paper, and that was just more of an icebreaker than anything.
I see. I can kind of see that too. Yeah. But, Bob goes back with Gene Gluharif a long time. You can still find pictures of Bob in the old jet catalogs. And this is stuff we used to get out of the back of Popular Science magazine. And Bob is sitting on a Schwinn banana seat bike with a little one of the jet engines on the back with a propane tank up under the bar in the front. And what I always saw Bob to be was somebody that maybe even aspired to show business or barnstorming or crash and burners like we have in our business. And for some reason, he went in the other direction. Now, I'm of the same kind of bent, but I'm in the entertainment business. What I do is showmanship. Bob seemed to be a showman, and when you have intelligence and when you got too close to the actual subject, he would get very tight-lipped. For instance, he wouldn't give me any details on what he was doing to increase the thrust on the car. And then I look at the pictures, and I'm going, my God, that's just an afterburner. Few mathematical numbers. Anybody could build it. There was nothing really, really earth-shaking or anything that would qualify him to work on that kind of propulsion.
Well, I would say that I don't really recall Bob ever claiming that he had re-engineered or made any kind of a propulsion breakthrough on the jet car. It was just happened to be some kind of an interest of his. But, John, maybe you can address that better than I could.
No, that's all I remember.
Hey, Bill, thank you for the call. I appreciate it. We're going to have to take another short break. We'll be right back with more of your calls to John Lear. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp, your guest host. My guest tonight, John Lear, and we're taking your calls. We're going to go now to our first-time caller line, Rich in Citrus Heights, California. Rich, what's on your mind?
Well, in 1986, it was September, I think, I was going over the interstate into Nevada. I was about 20 miles from the Nevada line, and I pulled around this bend at a place called Blue Canyon. There was no cars on the road, pitch black, no moon, a few stars, and so right up as I turned the bend, there's this big, like, UFO flying saucer. It didn't look like saucer shape, but I pulled over and I started walking towards it, and I could see the oscillating lights going around the exterior part of it, and it was like a yellowish-orange light that 4 or 5 of them would just run around the perimeter of it. And then it didn't make any noise. There was no sound at all. And it was really quiet up there, and no lights. And I was looking up, and it started doing a different oscillation, or something was different. So I turned to go back towards the car, and I kept my eye on what was behind me there, and this thing just sped off, just streaked off, and it was gone, and it didn't make a sound.
Did you have a question for John Lear?
Yeah, I was wondering if that gravitational thing could have been is quiet enough to where it doesn't
sounds
make
to me
noise.
like it was, yeah.
Yeah, the thing that described by Bob Lazar, I think, had no moving parts, did it, John?
No. No.
So it didn't make any noise.
No noise, no.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Rich. We're now going to go to our wild card number 1, Kurt in Washington, D.C. Staying up pretty late tonight, Kurt. What's on your mind?
Hey, good morning, gentlemen. How are you all doing? I have a question, but let me preface it by saying I had this vivid dream about 2 years ago, and needless to say, I'm interested in all this coast-to-coast type of program. I dreamt that I was on a secret mission working directly with the vice president, current vice president, putting bugs in hotel rooms. And it was just a job, nothing, no thought about it either way. And I woke up with the most odd feeling because I'm not a fan of the current administration. And I'm just wondering if you've heard any cases of people having those kinds of memories or thinking maybe that they have been pulled to do things and then erased kind of so they don't remember them.
I hear that all the time, but I don't know whether it's true or not.
Okay.
I've had some dreams about Heather Graham that I'm pretty sure didn't really happen. I'm just joking.
That's good. Thanks.
Hey, George, say the number again. Coupon's trying to reach us.
I'm going to give him a number. There's a hotline number, 818-501-4725. That's for Gene Huff, 818-501-4725. We're going to go down to our wild card 2 line. Brennan in Phoenix, what's on your mind?
Well, I had a two-part question. I'll ask you guys, and then I'll listen offline. It seems to me like it's kind of ridiculous to think the government would hire someone like Bob Lazar to be in a position like that, knowing that they would know that he's going to spill that information. What's he doing now? Where is he at now? And also, I had a uncle that actually was a geological physicist at Area 51 for 21 years. With all the nuclear testing going on there, is it possible that the lights in the sky are from that? Thanks.
John?
Bob runs UnitedNuclear.com out of Sandia Park in New Mexico, sells scientific supplies, and I didn't hear the second question.
He was asking about whether or not the physics, the nuclear testing might have something to do with why people are seeing saucer-type things, lights in the sky at Area 51.
I doubt that.
They haven't done any of that testing in quite some time, and the descriptions that you see, that you hear of these craft out there certainly don't sound like anything that's generated by those kind of tests. Certainly what we've seen on film, on video, certainly doesn't look like anything that was generated by a nuclear test, even though they've been gone for a lot of years.
Right.
I think we have time for one more call before we take another break. How about wildcard 4, Lee in New York?
Yeah, hi. I'm not familiar at all with Mr. Lear and his group, but I've been listening to the show now, and my complaint is that I don't really understand what is the point that he's trying to make. I mean, there's been a lot of, folks. You guys seem to know all the cast of characters that you're talking about, but we, the listeners, don't really know who they are. You haven't really filled us in on them too well. And what is the thrust of this discussion? Is it that aliens somehow have taught our scientists some secrets about anti-gravitational devices, and that's what has been being tested out at this place, Gruen Lake? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I'd say that was pretty much the central theme, and if you've missed that, then we've really done a really crummy job here tonight.
There's a lot of folksy anecdoting and talking about, was it April 29th or April 30th, or, all these little details, a smoke screen of details, and it's just been hard to kind of get down to the basics of what's being talked about here, and I listen all the time, and so I'm fascinated by the subject, but you've kind of lost me. along.
Well, ma'am, we apologize then if you missed that. If you're not familiar with Groom Lake in Area 51, I suppose maybe we have glossed over it a bit, but the topic has been so well known for so many years and have been discussed on this program so many times. I think maybe we made the false assumption. I made the false assumption that people had a basic understanding of the parameters of the story. And if you didn't get that, then I certainly would apologize for it. But I would have to say we've gone into quite a bit of detail about what's happened out there and why it's important. I mean, if you don't find it interesting that we have recovered alien technology and have been testing it in secrecy at a military base, boy, I have really missed the mark. But I thank you for the call nonetheless. Let's try to slip in one more call here before our break. Wildcard 3, Drew in Washington, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Well, I have a really simple question for you guys. I'm just curious to know, is there any kind of statistics on how many sightings of UFOs there are?
Not that I know of. I think that most sightings of UFOs are sightings of our technology, stuff that belongs to the government. The ET stuff, I think, is pretty rare. Having said that, I believe the Chicago sighting was ET.
Do you think there
Go ahead.
Are there a number of ET sightings, though?
Excuse me?
Are there a fair number of ET sightings, or is it just, are there actually some ET sightings, or do you think it's mostly made up?
No, there's a number of ET sightings. I'm just saying that most of them are probably our own technology.
Most ufologists will admit that probably 9 out of 10 UFO reports or UFO sightings are explainable, prosaic items, planets, things of that, clouds, or terrestrial vehicles. But it's also true that probably 9 out of every 10 UFOs that are seen are not reported at all.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Sure.
You think for someone who has like a television and radio background, it wouldn't be nervous or nerve-wracking going on your show? I still get pretty nervous.
No need to be nervous here. I appreciate you giving us a call, and thanks for listening. Okay, I think we're going to take, have we got time for one more call before we go to the break? Okay, we don't have time. So, John, if you're going to stick around, we'll take a couple more calls. A lot of folks are on the lines waiting to talk to you. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
I need 5 minutes for my hijack, Blackbird hijack.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we'll do that when we come back. Stick around. I'm George Knapp. This is Coast to Coast AM. Thanks for hanging in there with us, everyone. We're back with John Lear, speaking about Area 51 and Bob Lazar and all sorts of ufological topics. John, you had something else on your mind, though. We got a lot of people waiting to talk to you on our phone lines, but you had something else on your mind you wanted to say.
I'll make this very quick. It concerns the hijack of a Blackbird by the Secretary of the Air Force, Michael Wynn, General Michael Hayden, who's the director of the CIA, and General Charles Metcalf, director of the National Museum of Air Force. What happened is in 1990, the Air Force started to let all the SR-71s and A-12s go to museums. The Minnesota Air Guard took one, an A-12, restored it for 13 years, put thousands of man-hours into it and hundreds of thousands of dollars, got it all set, was on display at their museum, and last year the director of the CIA, Michael Hayden, thinks he needs an SR-71 outside of his office there on a post. So he gets General Wynn and General Metcalf to go to the Minnesota Air Guard with public money, take it down, take it to Omaha, get it ready for a pedestal, and to send it to the CIA. It's wrong. It's wrong that they did this. They're effectively taking stuff that belongs to the public, and a bill called named Senate Bill 437 has been introduced, and I'd just like anybody who's interested in righting a wrong to either fax or email Carl Levin, who is the head of the Chairman Senate Arms Committee and is holding this up, or your favorite congressman and senator, and say the simple message, send the Blackbird back to Minnesota. And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, Jim Goodall worked his butt off to collect all the parts and put that thing back into mint condition. Goodall, of course, has written about blackbirds extensively. The A-12, of course, was the precursor to the SR-71, the greatest airplane that was ever built that we know about anyway, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And at CIA, nobody will ever see it. You know, they put it on a post, and it's wrong. It needs to go back to Minnesota.
All right, so call your congressman folks out there. Let's see, we got a caller from Nevada here on our wild card line. Jerry in Nevada, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so thank you very much for taking my call. My question fits right in with your last statement. I have always been fascinated by the SR-71. I took my son to the Ogden, Utah, took a look at the museum over there and looked at that one real well. And the guy that was giving the speech and the info on it, at the end of it, he had a question and answer. And I asked him, I said, how fast does this thing actually fly? And he throws his chest out there, and he said, well, we're authorized to say Mach 3 plus. And I looked at him, I said, well, I had it figured for about Mach 6. And that guy turned white as a sheet. And I would like to ask Mr. Lear, how fast does that thing go before it comes apart?
It's not coming apart. It's limited by the inlet temperatures, and 332 is the fastest I know that it's been flown. 3.32.
Oh, 3.32. Okay.
Gerald Greenemeyer was the guy that took it to that speed. And like I say, it's limited by inlet temperatures. This information is good for about 1974, 1975. If they improved it after that, I didn't know about it, and Daryl didn't know about it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for satisfying my curiosity.
Okay.
Thanks, Jerry. We're going to go now to east of the Rockies line. Bob in Ohio, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, guys, for having the courage to talk about these things, so they tend to get a little bit spooky. Quick question for John, and then I'll, first of all, wouldn't you think it's obvious to me, and don't you think it's obvious, this is the first thing, that our planet simply just has been hijacked? The things that are going on, the reason Lazar and you're able to still be drawing air is because a little bit of information, they can't just whack everybody on the planet in the head all at once. So feeding a little bit of information here and there and letting some of it out. And obviously whatever you know and a few people here and there know is such a small picture, a small piece of the puzzle. The big picture, and here's what I think, maybe you agree with part of it, the planet's been hijacked. There's so much going on. The chemtrails over where in my area are severe. The things have been proven. I have Morgellons. This stuff is changing DNA. I believe vaccinations are fake, and they're changing DNA. And I think the overall picture is really radical. And most people are just, first of all, anybody that doesn't believe it is just wacky or just not informed. And we're just most people are just getting by with their little world and having a war here and there, and those things are just drawing attention elsewhere. But the big picture doesn't look too good to me, and I'm actually afraid to even talk about it, but I did it for the first time. And I will check out your website too, John. I didn't even know about that, but I certainly agree with everything you've said. I've been abducted. I know I have for a fact. And I always know everything when I turn to a radio station like this. It's like, I've experienced all this. I already knew that. I don't know why I know it.
All right. Thanks, Bob, for the comments. John, any comments about chemtrails, contrails?
He brought up some good points. I could give you a whole show on each one of those subjects.
What about the chemtrail part?
The chemtrails is where they're releasing reflective material to help counter global warming.
No kidding. So not poisons or medicines or anything like that? Okay. Thanks for the call. I think we've got time before we take our final break. Ron in San Francisco on our West of the Rockies line. Are you there?
I am.
What's on your mind?
My question's two-part, unfortunately. I hope you have time to answer it. One, I was lucky or kind of strange to hear William Cooper speak in '89 in a small UFO conference. He surely was passionate about the subject, but how accurate do you think his info regarding UFOs and underground bases was specifically Dulce, and also the second part, kind of a funny thing, I just randomly opened his book. Is it true that you told him that a certain retrovirus was created to kill blood-sucking aliens?
I don't think so. I never heard that one, but his information about Dulce was true.
And he seemed to think the Archuleta Mesa info was disinformation.
No, that was true.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on, and thank you guys for your work.
Thank you.
Thanks for the call. We probably should have got into Bill Cooper a little bit because I think the first TV appearance he ever made was on a show that I produced back then with John Lear. And I'll never live that down, I suppose, because Bill Cooper went on to, basically anybody that disagreed with him became a government disinformation agent. He would put out this paper about the alien cover-up, and he kept saying over and over, this is the final edition, and then just keep adding stuff to it over the years before he was gunned.
We cover Bill Cooper.
Yeah, we will do that. I think we can probably try to squeeze one more in. Ron in Pioneer, California, on our first-time caller. Are you there?
Hey, George and John, how you doing?
Howdy.
All right, actually, you're just talk about Cooper there. It's a good segue here before you go. I was reading a little bit more about that. I got his book, Behold the Pale Horse. Wanted to find out a little bit more about that. A couple questions. One, wanted to see actually if you guys could expand a little bit more about two things. Project Excalibur, if that rings a bell, and also the Krill papers. John, I know that was a big thing between you and Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, what happened was the Krill papers were written by John Grace in the summer of '88, and Bob Lazar wrote the Excalibur papers based on information that he got from Los Alamos. When Cooper and I were interviewed in my living room by one of the TV video programs that were going on in those days, he starts talking about the Krill papers and Excalibur that he'd seen in the Navy. And when we were done, I grabbed him and I took him in another room. I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "Bob Lazar wrote the Excalibur papers, and John Grace wrote the Krill papers." He said, "No, I saw those in the Navy." And that's when I realized that Bill Cooper had UFO disease. And UFO disease was when you run out of information, you're so enthralled with the notoriety you're getting, you start to make it up.
And that called into question pretty much everything that Bill Cooper wrote. That book, by the way, Behold a Pale Horse, I've heard it referred to as Behold a Pail of Horse.
Yeah, that was Lars Hanson's answer to Behold a Pale of Horse. That was great.
Anyway, John, stick around, and you listeners at home, stick around. We're going to take our final break. We'll be back and try to squeeze as many calls as we can in for John Lear. This is Coast to Coast AM, and I'm George Knapp. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm George Knapp. We have a few minutes left with our guest, John Lear. We're also joined, I think, on our wildcard line by Gene Huff. Just in case you hadn't followed our earlier conversation, Gene was a friend of Bob Lazar's before Bob went to work at Area 51. He's the guy who introduced Lazar to John Lear, and he lived through many of the events that we've been discussing tonight. Gene, you there?
I'm here.
You're here up kind of late tonight.
Listen, that trick with giving me the phone number to call in on live on the air worked really well. I think they had a lot of big Gene Huffs calling in.
Yeah, probably so. Any comments on what you've heard so far?
Yeah, the guy that called about Bob and the jet engines and Eugene Gluharef down there in the Tri-City area in California. I met Bob with Eugene Gluharef, and the guy's, while he's sets up his story about Bob and the jet engine and then gives us all of his opinions on Bob Lazar and his personality. Nothing he said was true. Bob had a jet engine and a Honda Civic and then later a Honda CRX, and they were both real jet engines. That the jet he's talking about was a propane jet, which we put on a jet go-kart. And in fact, for those of you that were at the last Desert Blast, Jim Taliani had it on his back, if I remember correctly, with a pair of roller skates on blowing around. So the guy has that story totally wrong.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a call. Stick around, Gene. Maybe you can chime in on this. How about our wild card line, Jonathan in Bakersfield? Are you there?
Good morning.
Good morning. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Before I ask my question about Area 51, John Lear, you listening?
Yeah.
Love your jets.
Hey, thanks.
I can't wait to get one. I write motion pictures as a Christian, but before I got repented, Jesus' name baptized, and Holy Ghost filled, I knew of a pastor who worked out at 51. We know this because while cleaning through his car, we found one of the badges, and he was kind of tight-lipped. But my question is, though I am repentant, Jesus' name baptized, Holy Ghost filled, as according to Acts 2:38, and many Christians are, or whether you're Jew, Muslim, or whatever, how do you think the outcome of all this will be, whatever it be, vague as it is, when it hits the fan, so to speak, for all humanity concerned that is alive and among us before the good Lord returns? Without being political, what's your feeling on that?
Everything will be just fine.
I mean, so like God being in control, of course, means we have to just have faith that he knows what he's doing, because, he deals on a need-to-know basis, too. We don't know when he's going to return. And I got to tell you, George,
yes,
you there? You got a fantastic show. I love you and Mr. Nuri. I told him a UFO story I had just after getting the Holy Ghost. Something really creepy happened. But I know of, people, like I said, you still there?
Yes.
That work out. There's this other man I know whose name obviously I cannot give, and we went out to supper once, and this man in a coat, this long coat, looked like he walked out of Men in Black, showed up, said, I have to talk to you right away privately, and all I heard was three different things: 51, alien protagonist, and we got to move now. So he had to take me home quick, and they were gone. I didn't see him for weeks. So just so you know, if people are listening, there is more truth than even you're allowed respectfully to give that is truth. And I want to let you know that our Holy Jesus name prayers are with you and yours, because, it's a great thing. It's to the glory of God to conceal matter, but to the glory of kings to search a matter out. And I hope everybody keeps you in their prayers, because what you're doing is very bold. We live in a nation of indifference, in a world of nothing but lies. And for you to do this is very brave. And I want to and please remember Acts 2:38. We love you all very much, and you're all in our prayers. And I thank you, okay?
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much. We're going to go to the West Coast line. Robert in the San Joaquin Valley, which is my old stomping ground.
Oh, is it really?
Oh, yeah, Stockton, Modesto, Sacramento, sure.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you, sir. And John?
Yeah.
This is Robert again. I've talked to you on Art's show a few times.
Yeah.
And your whole family, going back with Bill, building the Lear. I got all kinds of photographs and things that we've talked about. Sam Ode, John Heiser.
Yeah.
A lot of others, people you and I know. One of these days I got to get together with you.
Okay.
You living out of Vegas?
Yep.
Yeah. How's your gold mine going?
We're doing fine.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing you. And I have one question I'd like to bring up for the listeners with all that's happening nowadays. With these new developments with planes, have you been witness to, or can you even talk about it, the unmanned planes? And I'll cut it off there, and it's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you. What did he say, George?
He wants to know if you've seen any of these unmanned planes, which I can answer that for you a little bit. We have a base called Creech, which used to be known as Indian Springs, just outside of Las Vegas, and you can go sit on the freeway and watch them every day. It's like the number one place where they test them. I think probably all of us, everyone who lives here, has seen them once or twice. I'm going to go to Hector in New York on our first-time caller line. Hector, you there?
Yes.
What's on your mind?
Can you hear me good?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. I have a question about the validity to the claims about the reptiloids and how, they have to do with the Dulce Mountains areas and the conflict with the Greys and cooperation between, the government and things like that. So a quick second question would be about, the psychic defenses they have there. Can you infiltrate them with remote viewing or, astral projection?
Okay, let me answer the first one, remote viewing and astral projection. I don't know whether you can penetrate Dulce or not. It seems to me you would be able to, but I studied remote viewing, and it's real. Even a dummy like me can do it. The first question I didn't hear, George. Did you?
Something about reptoids. Gene, did you hear that one?
Probably wants to know how the reptoids fit in with
No, I didn't hear it. But I do have a question for John. I'd like to know, when the guy who thought the Holy Ghost prompted him to call this show wanted to know what would happen when they released the information. John, why did you say everything will be fine when you think that if men find out that they're not as high on the food chain as they thought they were, that everyone will be pretty nervous about that fact? Why did you let that guy slide?
I think everything's going to be fine.
Okay, good enough.
Do we have Floyd in San Antonio on the wild card line? Floyd, you there?
Yeah, yes. John Lear, a show or two back, mentioned that he got a several-hour tour of the Dulce, New Mexico area by the local sheriff or policeman there. He didn't tell a whole bunch about it. Could you just give some details of what happened during that tour?
Well, what happened is Gabe Valdez, who was the head of the highway patrol there in Dulce, when I went there to check things out, I called him up because I'd heard his name, and he said, I know you, John, and this was like in 1989. I said, you know me? And he said, yeah. Remember back in 1972, you flew in a Learjet here, and you had some steaks for Dean Martin, who was filming a movie here, and you brought in his girlfriend. And I said, I'll be darned, I remember that. He says, yeah, I was the one that met the airplane. And so I had known him from 20 years before. Anyway, I went on an 8-hour shift with him and talked about Dulce and all that happened around there. There wasn't anything specific. It was that, yes, Dulce existed. Yes, the locals knew about it. No, they weren't going to tell anybody else about it, and more or less that type of stuff.
Does that answer your question?
Well, yes. I just thought maybe John had actually seen something that night. Was what I was wondering about. So.
No, I didn't see anything that night.
By the way, George, I hate to interrupt, but I wanted to tell you I am sitting here with Bob Lazar's day-to-day wall calendar diary from late 1988 and early 1989. So I have all of the entries, and I just wanted to, John mentioned some of the dates before, and the first time he went out to S4, his calendar entry says trip to nowhere. And on April 6th, 1989, it says debrief